The report of the Mahon Tribunal is a chronicle of betrayal, ignominy and disgrace for the individuals that it names and condemns, for the system of planning in Dublin that was foully corrupted, and for the Fianna Fáil party, which more than any other housed those who have been found to be corrupt and wanting. The tribunal took a long time. The tribunal cost a lot of money, but it has got to the truth in a way that no other investigation into planning corruption has ever done. The truth has been expensive to obtain, but as we survey the damage to our economy and to our society, it is clear that not having the truth has been far more costly. The reports of the Mahon, and before that the flood tribunals, have far exceeded what many thought was possible at the time that the tribunal was established. They set out clearly how the planning process in Dublin during the 1980s and 1990s was undermined and corrupted by a number of developers who sought to enrich themselves and by a number of councillors who were prepared to accept bribes. It also provides another insight into the culture of corruption that existed for decades at the highest level of Fianna Fáil in particular. I want to express my appreciation to the members of the tribunal, Judges Mahon, Faherty and Keyes, and to Mr Justice Fergus Flood for the work that they have done and for the reports that they have produced. Over the years, there have been several people who raised questions about planning in Dublin, including journalists like Joe McAnthony, Frank MacDonald, Mark Brannock. But it was always extremely difficult, if not impossible, for anyone to prove anything without a formal inquiry. Indeed, I remember in 1990, shortly after I was elected to this House, calling in this House for an inquiry into planning and rezoning in Dublin. Because, like many other members of the then Dublin County Council, I shared a concern at what seemed to be happening at council meetings and at the way in which so many rezoning decisions were being taken. Based on what we now know, it is hardly surprising that no inquiry was conceded. I remember raising the issue in 1990, putting Dáil questions to the then Minister for the Environment, who was Mr Pádraig Flynn. He transferred them to the then Minister for Justice, who was Mr Ray Burke. They both served under Mr Charles Haughey as Taoiseach and in a government which had Mr Albert Reynolds as Minister for Finance and Mr Bertie Ahern as Minister for Labour. Needless to say, no inquiry was granted. Even when a tribunal was finally established, it was by no means certain that it would be able to get at the truth. Over the following 15 years, the tribunal was met by a wall of obstruction and obfuscation. There were many people who did not want the inquiry to succeed, and many of them took their cases to the courts, which delayed the work of the inquiry for very long periods of time. And when it looked to be getting to the truth about Mr Ahern, for example, the tribunal was subjected to a series of attacks by Fianna Fáil ministers, which is rightly the subject of severe criticism in the report itself. In the face of this obstruction, and in spite of these attacks, the tribunal has now concluded its work, and its final report is little short of devastating. This was not a report about individual councillors taking bribes. What this report finds is that there was systemic corruption in the planning system in Dublin. And further, it makes adverse findings against elected representatives at that time at every level of elected office, from County Council to the then office of Taoiseach. Councillors, senators, TDs, ministers, two Taoiseach, and indeed a member of the European Commission. This is not, as some are still trying to suggest, just a few rotten apples. All three individuals who led Fianna Fáil from 1979 until May 2008, all of whom held the office of Taoiseach, have now been the subject of adverse findings by tribunals of inquiry, including the Beef Tribunal, the Moriarty Tribunal and now the Mahon Tribunal. Yes, there are politicians from other parties against whom adverse findings have been made, but the evidence shows that the problem was overwhelmingly a Fianna Fáil problem. The report does not, as was widely reported on RTE last week, make adverse findings against any current member of the Labour Party. It made an adverse finding against one individual who was previously a member of the Labour Party, who was elected a councillor in 1991, who was expelled from the party in 1993 when it was considered that he was not acting in accordance with the standards that the Labour Party expected of him. It did not require a tribunal and 15 years for the Labour Party to take action against that individual. The report shows that simple truths cannot be hidden in complicated and elaborate excuses. But we do ourselves no service either by reducing complexity to excessive simplifications. The report finds that there was corruption at every level in Irish political life, but it does not say that every politician is corrupt. The report condemns several politicians, but it commends others. There were some, for example, who sought to imply that my colleague, Minister Rabbitte, had questions to answer. And I want to record here that Minister Rabbitte answered all questions and that his actions were commended by the tribunal. I want to note also the part played by my colleague, Minister Joan Burton, who sought to expose wrongdoing and who was threatened for her efforts with legal action for attempting to do so. It has been said, and it is true, that there are many honourable and decent people in Fianna Fáil who have been let down by the actions of their leaders, who feel reduced by the findings of this report. But they are not the victims here. The victims are the people who live in poorly planned communities. The victims are those who have lost their jobs, who are in negative equity and who are picking up the tab for the destruction of our economy. Because there is a direct connection between the corruption unearthed by the tribunal and the fact that our economy has been brought to the edge of collapse. The property bubble was a product of the toxic triangle between Fianna Fáil, the banks and property developers. There was a culture at the highest levels of Irish society that sought to make extraordinary fortunes on property development, and some politicians were determined to have their share. The question for Fianna Fáil is why it took so long for anyone to act. It is important to place the report of the tribunal in its proper historical perspective. The seeds of this problem go back much further than the events investigated by the Mahon Tribunal. The problem in Fianna Fáil goes back to the transition that took place in the early 1960s, when the revolutionary generation within that party gave way to a new leadership. Look back in history and you find that in the first two ministerial offices to which he was appointed, Mr Haughey replaced first Oscar Traynor as Minister for Justice and then Patrick Smith at Agriculture. Both men were veterans of the War of Independence and the Civil War. Mr Haughey, in contrast, was the leading light of a new generation, remarkable for its association with Taca, a body devoted to raising funds for Fianna Fáil, a forerunner of the Galway Tent. It is not unknown for post-colonial societies to experience problems of corruption when the idealism of the revolutionary era begins to wane, and when governments are faced with the challenges of economic development. As a new state begins to take an active role in economic development, it is common enough to find that opportunities arise for office holders to dishonestly enrich themselves. It is only fair to say that during the 1980s in particular, there were many in Fianna Fáil who opposed Mr Haughey and who sought to remove him as leader, and some even left the party as a result. It is also fair to say that many who supported Mr Haughey did so out of genuine political motivations, particularly in respect of his views on Northern Ireland. It is all the more disappointing, then, that so little was learned when problems came to light again under Mr Ahern. The report of the tribunal refers to the standard of proof that it applies, which is a civil standard. Its findings are based on a balance of probability. Other bodies, including the Revenue Commissioners and the Gardaí, have their own well-established standards and procedures which they will now apply. The Criminal Assets Bureau has a particular role to play, since the legislation governing the CAB requires those being investigated to demonstrate that the source of their income is legitimate and not the other way around. But there is also a political standard of proof, a higher standard, a standard that was failed to be applied, both when ministers attacked the tribunal itself and when they continued to support Mr Ahern as Taoiseach. The evidence that Mr Ahern gave to the tribunal was manifestly inadequate. It was manifestly clear that he was unable to account for substantial amounts of money that he received. His explanations were little short of bizarre. That was obvious to anyone who read or listened to his evidence. There was a widespread view in the country at the time that his evidence was not believable, something which the tribunal has now confirmed. It was clear for anyone to see that he was not cooperating with a sworn inquiry established by the Oireachtas. It was also clear, or should have been clear, that this placed him in an impossible position as Taoiseach, and in that situation, others around Mr Ahern had a duty to act and to uphold the political standard of which I speak. In fact, their reaction was not to deal with the problem in front of them, but to attack the tribunal itself. And as late as yesterday, Mr Ahern continued to attack it when he knows that the members of the tribunal cannot debate with him in public. At the same time, the Green Party, then in office, looked the other way. The Green ministers deliberately chose to ignore what was happening at the tribunal. Count Corla, I can understand if there are those who see this report as yet another report on top of another tribunal after another inquiry, or who look at what has happened in this country over the past 5 years and who simply remark that no one, banker, developer or politician, has gone to jail. I don't blame anyone who is utterly frustrated by the slow pace at which investigations into the banking collapse have been proceeding, and I share that frustration. As elected representatives, it is right that we distance ourselves from the administration of justice, that the law is and is seen to be impartial. But it is also surely right that as public representatives we can express the frustration of the public that justice delayed is justice denied. For the past 12 months, this government has been engaged in the task of restoring political, financial and economic stability, of bringing the Republic back from the edge of bankruptcy. But there is more than one way to be bankrupt. Our Republic stands not just on laws and the Constitution, but on the trust and confidence that we repose in each other and in the institutions of the state. And that trust has been badly damaged. But it is not damaged beyond repair. No matter how great the temptation, despair is a luxury we cannot afford. To those who want to write off politics and political life, I simply ask, what is the alternative? The alternative to democratic politics is to be seen in the repression, the chaos, the violence of places like Syria, Mali, Belarus and many other states today. There is plenty of evidence in this report of individuals who betrayed the trust that was placed in them. But there is evidence too of others who did everything they could do to expose corruption and who are commended by the tribunal. The very fact that the tribunal was set up is the result of action taken by citizens acting in the public interest. The government will work its way through the economic crisis. We will examine the recommendations of the tribunal and bring forward proposals for reform. We will involve the people directly in the work of a constitutional convention which will look at how the political system can be reformed and the Republic can be renewed. We will bring forward laws to make it harder for this to happen again, laws which should never have been, which should have been enacted in a previous era. My colleague, the Minister for Environment, Community and Local Government, has already sent the report to the Director of Public Prosecutions and to the Garda Commissioner, as well as to the chairs of the Revenue Commissioners and the Standards and Public Office Commission for their consideration and for whatever further investigative steps are considered appropriate. The Garda Commissioner has since referred the report to the Criminal Assets Bureau and has asked the Bureau's head to lead the Garda examination of the report and any follow-up action. As the Tribunal has itself noted, it is estimated that the Criminal Assets Bureau and the Revenue have between them already recovered over £51 million as a result of the work of the Tribunal. At its meeting today, the Government decided that all relevant ministers should consider urgently the Tribunal's recommendations and revert to the Department of Environment, Community and Local Government as the coordinating department by the end of April at the latest with proposed actions in response. Minister Hogan will report back to Government on our collective responses to the Tribunal's recommendations as early as possible in May. Some of these recommendations are already in the course of implementation, including legislative proposals in relation to political funding, corruption, whistleblowers and the registration of lobbyists. In the long history of our people, each generation has been confronted by its own historic challenge. This is ours, to rescue the economy, to restore hope and confidence in our country, and to restore the trust that we should all have in our public institutions. To leave behind us a system of government, a republic, that enjoys the respect and allegiance of all our people. The report of the Mahon Tribunal hopefully leaves behind an era of corruption that must never be repeated, and it provides us with the recommendations and the guidance which will help us along the road, not just to economic recovery, but to ethical recovery as well.